Keep your wallet happy with $4.95 flat rate shipping at Provident Metals. Any order, any size. Ships for one low rate, all September long. Shop with the People's Bullion Dealer, ProvidentMetals.com. Your wallet is going to love you.
In our last video, we showed you how Senator John McCain, Republican of Arizona, met this May with some unsavory characters in a secret trip to Syria. But given McCain's history of consorting with dubious groups from Libya to Syria, whom he calls heroes and freedom fighters, but whom the U.S. State Department, UN Security Council, and media refers to as terrorist organizations, it's understood, if nothing else, that making the world safe for democracy in the 21st century is indeed a dirty business. Who profits from this business is the topic of today's video. So now we move from Senator John McCain's friends to NGOs, think tanks, and policy circles responsible for providing American leadership with actionable information and advice. But more importantly, how these NGOs and think tanks develop U.S. strategic objectives in order to maintain and propel their corporate benefactors' interests throughout the world. Breaking news on the Drudge Report Wednesday was headlined, "Curveball, Woman Behind Case for Syria Strike Fired for Lying." This woman was Elizabeth O'Baggy, fired by the Institute for the Study of War for allegedly lying on her resume. If you're unfamiliar with O'Baggy, she orchestrated Senator John McCain's meeting with Syrian rebels and the alleged kidnappers he was photographed with in May of this year. As the Daily Caller's Charles Johnson notes, O'Baggy's advocacy for intervention had brought her to remarkable clout at the young age of 26. Her Wall Street Journal op-ed was recently cited by Secretary of State John Kerry. But she not only got airtime in Congress and print, but in some of the most watched shows in American newsdom.
As you detail it, there are more good guy groups that the U.S. can work with, outnumbering the extremist elements by far.
Right, absolutely. And I think that the point has been made in the press that either side, whether the regime or the rebels, there's really no side fighting for U.S. interests. And again, I think that what I've tried to show through this research and by traveling around with many of these rebel groups is that there are actually a majority of the opposition that would be in line with U.S. interests.
Okay.
According to O'Baggy's boss, Kimberly Kagan, president and founder of the Institute for the Study of War, she claimed O'Baggy lied about her PhD from Georgetown University when she did not actually have one. But the ISW in March acknowledged as much, claiming O'Baggy was working on a dissertation, as in she had not yet received a PhD. Kagan also claims O'Baggy's work in Syria is rock solid, reports the Politico. So was it really her resume in limbo which got her canned, or the fact that the ISW, described by Washington Post as favoring aggressive U.S. foreign policy, was dragged through the mud when O'Baggy was connected with one of the most unpopular wars in American history, as well as with one of the many propagandist organizations suffering intense media scrutiny in the run-up to strikes in Syria? For instance, O'Baggy's August 30th op-ed for the Wall Street Journal came under fire, according to Politico, for misrepresenting her affiliations. Originally, the op-ed only listed O'Baggy as a senior analyst at ISW. The Wall Street Journal later added in a clarification her connection to a Syrian advocacy group. It said, in addition to her role at the Institute for the Study of War, Ms. O'Baggy is affiliated with the Syrian Emergency Task Force, a nonprofit operating as a 501c3 pending IRS approval that subcontracts with the U.S. and British governments to provide aid to the Syrian opposition. The Syrian Emergency Task Force's executive director is Muaz Mustafa, an expert at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a satellite of the huge Israeli lobby, American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee. Now, the AIPAC regularly lobbies for U.S. intervention in the Middle East on behalf of Israeli interests, and it regularly attempts to ensconce into U.S. law Israel as an ally of the United States. Moreover, the SETF website's URL belongs to the Torah Academy of Boca Raton, Florida, espousing, again, Israel's interests abroad. Mustafa and O'Baggy were again the ones who orchestrated John McCain's secret rendezvous with the Free Syrian Army and the Northern Storm Brigade last May. And as Charles Johnson notes of the Daily Caller, O'Baggy admits she was paid for her contractual work with Mustafa and SETF by the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Conflict and stabilization operations. And this is big business, as the State Department contracting firms like ARK or Access Resource Knowledge, Chemonics, Creative Associates International, and a number of other big contractors set up the contracts and paid the Syrian Emergency Task Force out of the $500 million allotted for institution building in Syria. In other words, it all comes full circle. John McCain and John Kerry, among many others, are using information gathered from organizations advocating for Syrian rebels and paid for by you. Moreover, the Institute for the Study of War, which Obagi received her salary, is seeded and funded by the elite within the military-industrial complex, namely Northrop Grumman, the CIA's Palantir, DynCorp International, and General Dynamics, companies which have everything to gain from our wars in the Middle East. Yesterday I spoke with popular New York-based independent geopolitical analyst Eric Draitser, founder of the website StopImperialism.org, and regular contributor to RT and Press TV.
Well, I think that this is yet another example of the manufactured nature of the war hysteria that has gripped Washington and the political establishment and the ruling elite for the last few weeks at least, and I mean really for the last 2 years. Those who have been pushing war on Syria and the entire war narrative, the ammunition that they use is almost always manufactured and or fabricated out of these types of think tank structures and NGO organizations and so forth, from which well, what can we call her? This liar, Obagi, comes from. And so it really comes as no surprise to me and to, I think, informed observers that somebody like her has been exposed as, as a manufactured mouthpiece and propagandist for war. And I think more to the point, it illustrates the very intimate connections that exist between these so-called elected officials and the intelligence establishment, because of course, as we know, these think tanks are part of a much larger network, and one could think of them as the intelligence, the intelligence establishment and the various organs that orbit the intelligence establishment. I mean, some of the more well-known ones like the Brookings Institution or the Heritage Foundation or, Open Society on the other side of the political spectrum, the Open Foundation and so forth. All of these organizations are really, whether they have political disagreements and varying political ideologies, they all emerge out of the same swamp, the same quagmire, and that is, of course, finance capital. They are all repositories for Wall Street profits and Wall Street financiers that own and operate these organizations. So when we're talking about the intimate relationship between finance capital and the military-industrial complex, these are more than just words. The John McCain, Elizabeth Obagi, Syria connection is merely the latest example in a long historical trend of these organizations working together to push war. Well, there's a few different things I think you're bringing up. Just to put a finer point on what you just mentioned, this question of the nonprofit status, the 501c3 status, that I think illustrates perhaps more specifically the point that I was just making regarding the connection between these various institutions and Wall Street and finance capital, because the tax-free, tax-exempt status that organizations like this enjoy is the reason for their existence. It is the reason why financiers and speculators and the ultra-mega wealthy found these type of institutions, not the least of which reason being that it's a perfect way to hide their money tax-free. So the connections, and I mean, we could probably do hours just on these connections. I mean, they go very, very deep, and they really kind of explain why this vast array of NGOs and other organizations exist. But the constellations that you're referring to, the relationships between them are very complex, because sometimes they are purely political, sometimes sometimes they're economic, and sometimes they're both. For example, I think one of the more well-known ones, and perhaps one of the ones that people really should be keeping at the forefront of their thinking, is the connection between the State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy, because it is through the NED, through the National Endowment for Democracy, that the U.S. intelligence establishment and the U.S. government is able to own and operate many of these organizations. So whether you're talking about, a manufactured opposition movement in Myanmar, whether you're talking about, organizations in Egypt before the Tahrir Square protests of 2011, whether you're talking about any of these parts of the world, you will see the fingerprint of the National Endowment for Democracy. And the various think tanks really kind of provide the intellectual scaffolding for the organizations that we're referring to. So when we, I think the last time we spoke, we referred to the very important white paper that was published by the Brookings Institute regarding saving Syria, assessing options for regime change. Well, what is that but a blueprint for exactly what the Obama administration and the Israelis and the various other international forces have been doing in Syria all along. So it is where the quote unquote policy wonks and policy nerds get together and create the strategies that are then implemented by the so-called elected officials. So really what we see then is a symbiotic relationship between the intellectual side, the economic side, and the political side, all of which working together in a mutually beneficial way to push the war agenda. So when we're trying to examine this, we need to get away from thinking about it as some kind of a monolithic entity or something that exists in a vacuum. Rather, they are interdependent and interlocking, and that is really the way that the elite operate.